I've never really got the idea of an encore. How did we all kind of collectively get into this trap where we go to see a band, they play their full set, they play their last song and say goodnight, and then we have to sort of sit there and keep clapping and clapping and clapping until they come back out and then play another song or two and then say goodnight again, but they really mean it this time, so we're all just clapping and ready to go home. How have we all been trained to do this? It's social disciplining at its finest, right? And if I'm being honest, most of the time when I go to a concert, when the last song is played and I clap, I'm kind of ready for it to be over. I mean, it's late, and I'm tired, and I'm kind of old. So, it's time to go home. See, the problem is that some people just don't know when to quit. Which brings us back to Napoleon Bonaparte. You thought you'd heard the last of Napoleon Bonaparte. Well, you hadn't. In this video, we're going to look at the last gasp of Napoleon Bonaparte, a period called the 100 Days. And we're going to ask ourselves, what did the 100 days do to solidify Napoleon's revolutionary legacy? Okay, let's get going. For this video, you're going to need something to take notes with and two primary sources: Napoleon's proclamation upon his return to France and the Actua dicionelle, which you'll find out more about later. They'll call it a comeback. Okay, let's pick up where we left off. Napoleon's empire had fallen, the Allied coalition had basically taken over all of Europe, and the Senate had deposed Napoleon and declared him no longer the Emperor of the French. Upon his capture, Napoleon was forced to formally abdicate the throne of France and to sign a treaty between himself and the various Allied powers. In the treaty, he renounced for himself and his family all claims to sovereignty in any part of Europe. But the Allied powers were at least somewhat gracious. They allowed Napoleon and his wife, Marie-Louise, to retain their noble titles and even agreed to supply them with an annual pension of 2 million francs. The emperor was, however, forced to go into exile to the tiny island of Elba in the Mediterranean. He was deemed the Emperor of Elba, which is little consolation for the one-time Emperor of France. He thought, and many thought, that his political career was over. No longer, hoped the Allies, would the great general torment the continent of Europe. And as you can see, many celebrated this in cartoons such as this. Upon Napoleon's exile, the next question to face the victorious Allies was, what do we do with France? It seemed unlikely that they would place power back in the hands of the populace. The monarchs of Europe blamed the French people for having created the revolution that had led to the decades of warfare and upended the traditional structures of European society. Metternich, the Austrian prime minister and the most important voice within this coalition, declared that the only route to stability in Europe was through a restoration of quote-unquote legitimate monarchs to all the thrones of Europe. This included France, and so, in May 1814, the Allied powers brought Louis, Comte de Provence, aka Louis XVIII, and the brother of Louis XVI, back to France to reign as king. Louis had been in exile since 1791. It had been only over 20 years since he'd lived in the nation that he was now to rule. So many saw Louis XVIII as an outsider, someone who couldn't possibly identify with the French people now. And everyone acknowledged that his only claim to authority was the power and backing of the rest of the kings of Europe, as this cartoon clearly illustrates. Yet there were some in France who welcomed him back. Besides royalists, collaborators like Talleyrand, who upon being dismissed by Napoleon had immediately begun working for Metternich and plotting against the emperor. They ushered in the new Bourbon Restoration and served in the government in order to help it gain legitimacy. Louis XVIII processed into Paris on May 3rd, escorted by units of Napoleon's old imperial guard. According to some, the procession was almost silent, more a funeral march than a triumphant entry. This was the first restoration. The revolution had ended. The Bourbons were once again in control in France. and the revolution's legacy was still very much in question. But as Louis XVIII was continuing to solidify his control and chart the course of the country, Napoleon Bonaparte once again made his name known. It happened in February 1815. Napoleon managed to evade his captors and find his way off the island into the shores of France. Word is that though he was set up in a beautiful estate in Elba and made the ruler of the island, he never really resigned himself to retirement. Accounts are that he constantly kept up with what was happening in France. Napoleon also claimed that he was not receiving the promised pensions granted to him, and that there were rumors that the British were going to forcibly remove him from the island. Whatever the reason, Napoleon found himself on the shores of France on February 25th, 1815, announcing that he intended to march on Paris and reclaim his throne. Why did Napoleon return, and how could he win back the support of people in France? These questions are partially answered by the first primary source that I want you to read, Napoleon's proclamation upon his return. So pause the video and check that one out right now. How did Napoleon justify himself? How did he try to win over support from the people of France? Well, here's a passage that I thought was really important in his proclamation. Here's what Napoleon said. "Raised to the throne by your choice, all that has been done without you is illegitimate. For 25 years, France has had new interests, new institutions, a new glory, which could only be guaranteed by a national government, and by a dynasty born in these new circumstances. A prince who would reign over you, who would sit on my throne by the force of the same armies which ravaged our territory, would seek in vain to bolster himself by principles of feudal rights. He could only assure the honor and the rights of a small number of individuals, enemies of the people, who for 25 years have condemned them in all our national assemblies. Your peace at home and your respect abroad would be forever lost." Okay, look at all the ways that Napoleon is tapping into his kind of revolutionary legacy here. He's affirming that he was a person that was on the throne by the choice of the people. He said that his dynasty was one that was born in the circumstances of the revolution, out of the institutions of the revolution, out of the values of the revolution. He accused the Bourbon monarchs of bringing back feudalism, right? The rights and all the privileges that had existed in the old regime and that the revolution worked so hard to eliminate. And finally, he said that the Bourbon Restoration wouldn't actually bring stability, right? The only person who had brought stability effectively to France was him. What's interesting is the reaction that he received. Just months after so many had turned on him, Napoleon found himself relatively unopposed as he made his way north. Louis XVIII kept expecting guard units to stop him, but many, having served with Napoleon previously, instead joined along. This perhaps had to do with the message that Napoleon presented to these people. Here he was, the last best hope of the revolution in France. It was time for people to choose, either fight with him and for the revolution, or accept its destruction. The message was a compelling one, compelling enough to get him all the way to Paris, where once again he made his way to the Tuileries Palace on March 20th, 1815. Louis XVIII and his court had already fled to Belgium. In reality, the feelings of most were ambiguous. Many members of the bourgeoisie, for example, were reluctant to embrace Napoleon because of the inevitable war that would ensue when he took the throne. The past decade of fighting had been devastating to the French economy and to French merchants specifically. Most simply wanted stability and didn't see how there could be any stability with Napoleon at the throne. Even members of Napoleon's former council, including his one-time second consul, Cambaceres, were kind of reluctant to join on. Those who did flock to Napoleon were those who had traditionally been the most closely identified with the revolution and its most radical phases. Groups of former National Guard units jumped on, veterans, and sans-culottes even, all joined the Napoleonic coalition. It was clear, within the context of a restored Bourbon monarchy, where Napoleon's greatest base of support would be. For this reason, Napoleon leaned far more conspicuously toward the Jacobin end of the political spectrum than ever before, and embraced Jacobin language and many Jacobin policies. In a declaration upon retaking the throne, Napoleon claimed that he had returned, quote, "to save Frenchmen from the slavery in which priests and nobles wish to plunge them. Let them beware, I will string them up from the lampposts." Jean-Paul Marat couldn't have done any better with that statement. The ex-terrorist Vadier came out of retirement at the age of 80 to assist Napoleon. Napoleon also brought back ex-Jacobins, including the former member of the Committee of Public Safety, Barrère, and Lazare Carnot, and, of course, Fouché. To illustrate how Napoleon's appeal reached former Jacobins and those most closely identified with the revolution of yesteryear, we can consider the support that Napoleon won from Jean-Denis Lanjuinais. Lanjuinais was an ex-Girondin and a member of the convention. He'd always been an anti-Bonapartist, because of Bonaparte's desire for centralization, mainly. Lanjuinais was a decided Republican. He opposed the Brumaire coup, voted no on the life consulate and the hereditary empire, both the 1802 and 1804 plebiscites, and called for the deposition of Napoleon in 1814. This guy was a decided enemy of Bonaparte. Yet, 10 months into the Bourbon experiment, he rallied to Napoleon's side. Napoleon was now the only hope for the solidification of the gains of the revolution. Napoleon sealed the deal with the Jacobins by writing an addition to the imperial constitution that accommodated many Jacobin demands. The very fact that he made up with Benjamin Constant, his most vocal critic, and the first person he pushed out of the tribunate when he purged that institution in 1802, and asked Constant to write the additional act, reveals how far he was willing to go for the Jacobins and the radical Republicans. You're going to read this in a moment, so I won't tell you what's in it, but suffice to say that it was far more liberal than anything Napoleon had put out since the Empire. As before, Napoleon decided that he must put his new constitution to the people to gain popular support, but this time the results revealed sort of mixed opinions on Napoleon and his new regime. There was outward resistance from royalists in the south and west. In the Midi, royalist mayors flatly refused to conduct the vote. In the end, only 1.55 million people approved of the plebiscite. Abstention rates throughout the country were incredibly high. Napoleon would never again have the type of popular support that he had in 1802 and 1804. To make clear just how much of a turn Napoleon had made toward the Jacobins, we should pause the video now and take a look at our second primary source, the Actua dicionelle, that was written largely by Benjamin Constant. The Acte Additionnel was not the Jacobin Constitution of 1793. Napoleon didn't go that far, but he did seem to compromise a lot of what his early ideas were and a lot of the ways that he had structured his governments in the past. Check out, for example, this passage that illuminates this a little bit. The French people declare that it has not intended and does not intend to give the right to propose the reestablishment of the Bourbons or any prince of that family upon the throne, nor the right to reestablish either the ancient feudal nobility or the feudal and seigneurial rights or the tithes or any privileged and ruling worship, or the power to bring any attack upon the irrevocability of the sale of the national domains. It especially forbids to the government, the chambers, and the citizens any proposition of this kind. This is just one article in that long constitutional addendum, but it's an important one, because what it shows in this one is that Napoleon was committed to certain elements of the revolution. He was uncompromising in certain aspects of what the revolution had accomplished. For example, he was uncompromising in allowing feudalism to come back to France. He wanted to make sure that everyone knew that his empire would once again affirm the abolition of feudal rights and feudal privileges. He was also uncompromising in the ways that the revolution had limited the church. No more would the tithe come back and be levied upon the populace. He was also uncompromising on protecting property, and especially the revolutionary properties, the old church lands that people during the revolution had bought up and made tons of money from, extraordinary wealth from. And finally, he was uncompromising in allowing the Bourbons to be back on the throne. Napoleon was going to defend his claim to the throne for as long as he lived, and he was not going to allow France to return to the old regime. No matter how much support Napoleon gained in France, the big question was how would the rest of Europe, all the other European monarchs, deal with the return of the emperor? Well, Napoleon found out very quickly after he took the throne, because shortly after Napoleon's return to Paris, the coalition of European monarchs once again started to mobilize and started to prepare to go to war against Napoleon once again. There was no doubt in anyone's minds that the monarchs of Europe would once again join forces to stop Napoleon. He could not be allowed to return to his place of prominence after they had fought so hard to rid Europe of the Corsican. Plus, they were confident in their ability to win again. Napoleon didn't have time to muster a sizable force. He didn't have the resources that he once had, or even the widespread support. The Allies knew that this time Napoleon would be way overmatched. The Allied forces assembled and met Napoleon in Belgium, near the town of Waterloo, just south of Brussels. This would be the last major battle that Napoleon would fight. The French forces were relatively green and the grounds were muddy. Napoleon couldn't maneuver in the ways that he traditionally had, in the ways that had brought him success. Thus, the battle turned into frontal assaults, and it cost both sides dearly. The assembled armies fought basically to a draw, but Napoleon couldn't afford a draw. He needed a massive victory. The British and Prussians had allies coming to supplement their ranks. Napoleon was friendless, so having lost the ability to secure a decisive victory, Napoleon retreated to Paris. The Allies once again pursued him, overtook him in Paris for the second time in a year and a half, and captured the revolutionary capital. Once again, at the caprices of the monarchs of Europe, Napoleon was forced to abdicate once again. And once again, members of his own government joined in the effort to depose their emperor. This time it wasn't Talleyrand, but Lafayette, actually, who led the charge in the Chamber of Deputies. Napoleon was captured, sent to the far-off island of St. Helena, where he eventually died years later. His followers were disarmed, and all those former Jacobins who had rallied to his side were exiled from France. Royalists throughout the country took out their revenge in another sort of quote-unquote white terror, mostly against those who had supported the emperor in his comeback. Reaction set in many ways. The Allies, for their part, decided that France must be punished for its final dalliance with the revolution. Louis XVIII was brought back to the throne, but France was forced to pay large war indemnities and agree to a foreign occupation for 3 years. The territory of France was reduced and pushed back to its revolutionary frontiers. For example, this is what the territory was like at Napoleon's height. And this is the map of Europe after 1815 and Waterloo. The nations of Europe also began to roll back many of the revolutionary measures that Napoleon had put into place in their lands. The king of Piedmont Sardinia, for example, abolished all French legislation. The Pope abolished the Napoleonic Code in Rome, as well as other Napoleonic innovations, such as mandatory smallpox vaccines and street lighting. King Ferdinand VII of Spain brought back the Spanish Inquisition. It seemed that Europe was returning to its previous state before the Revolution. But nothing could erase from the memories of everyone in Europe the deep impact that the Revolution had had, both in France and abroad. Try as they might, the forces of restoration could only turn back the clock so far, and they never really got rid of the revolutionary spirit that lived on, continued to shape the political and social environments of Europe for decades to come. But that's a story for another class.
100 Days was so interesting because it's the period in which we see Napoleon at perhaps his most revolutionary. But that makes sense. Within the context of the Bourbon Restoration, it was kind of clear to many people in France and to Napoleon himself that Napoleon was, at this point, sort of the best possible option for anyone who had any stake in the revolution and its legacy in France. Yet even in this time, Napoleon was not the embodiment of liberty, equality, and fraternity. He was still an emperor. He still basically sort of consolidated his control through use of force. And his popular support in 1815 was much, much lower than a decade earlier. But the 100 Days actually had a really significant impact on France. There were enough people that saw Napoleon as sort of the best chance of the revolution that people that came after it, that the Bourbons who came after it, realized that the revolution wasn't just going away. Right? There were enough people that supported Napoleon in the 100 Days to convince them that the Bourbons had to make some sort of connection, some sort of conciliation with the legacy and rules and laws of the revolution and the ideals of the revolution. So the 100 Days actually pushed Louis XVIII sort of in a more moderate direction for most of the rest of his reign. As for his brother, Charles, the Comte d'Artois, that original émigré who had been trying to go to war against the revolution for basically the previous 20 years, well, it's a little more complicated with him, but that's another story for another class. As for this class, well, here ends our tour of the French Revolution. Thank you so much for watching all these videos, and I hope they were informative and sometimes at least a little fun. And as always, good job, good luck. I'll see you in class today, tomorrow,
or maybe just sometime in the future. Okay? See you later.